Good afternoon. Well, in a sense, Pope John Paul II is probably the best known person in the world. And you probably already think you know the salient facts about him. But if you're like most people, like I was before I went to work on this book, many of the most important things you think you know about him are wrong. So some of what I'm going to say here may startle you, and from time to time you might think, well, boy, I wonder if he could supply proof of that. In Man of the Century, 678 text pages and another 75 or so of notes and index, I think I have provided proof of what I say from fully attributed eyewitness accounts and quotations from documents, many of which have never before seen public light, and often in the Pope's own words. To illustrate, let me take his attitude toward women, which is a matter of great concern to Catholics and others in the United States, although to me it seems a relatively minor point overall. Through his public and his private deeds, John Paul has pushed the Catholic Church farther toward gender equality and toward a feminist agenda than it has ever been. Obviously, that's quite a contradiction from his public image. Much more important, I think, is his vital role in the conduct and resolution of the Cold War, the single greatest struggle of our era, and in its aftermath in world politics. His work, which ended the Cold War with a peaceful victory for freedom, spanned decades, not just his time as Pope. This work has been completely misreported until now, and because of this, the central history of our time is poorly understood. Your own Chicago historian, Gary Wills, whose work I otherwise greatly admire, has actually written at length that the Pope is a mystic, a non-political person who would have played no part in political activities. I think I will persuade you otherwise. I really think that in 4.5 years, going on 5, that I've been doing intense research, I have come to know this man about as well as anyone, but perhaps his longtime secretary and maybe a few others. I've interviewed more than 100 people who have known him at close quarters for long periods of his life, and I've interviewed many of them practically to the point of exhaustion over multiple days. I've interviewed hundreds of other people who have known him and read written recollections from more than 100 others. I've combed through his old letters at the homes of friends and spent more than a year's concentrated time in libraries reading the hundreds of thousands of words he has written. I've quoted at length in Man of the Century selected passages from his writing that should convey his thoughts clearly. John Paul has probably published more words than any other man who ever lived, and yet his style is often difficult, and this accounts, I think, in large part for why he's so poorly understood. If you would ask most people, for example, what his greatest changes have been in Catholic doctrine, they would probably say these changes had something to do with sexual repression. In fact, his main writing on sex, a book published in 1960, which he has not departed from in his frequent remarks since then, modernized and liberalized existing church attitudes toward sex. His book shocked many in the Roman Curia. He advocated female orgasm. He insisted that the pleasure of both parties was an essential element for acceptable sex, not just openness to procreation. More importantly, he rooted his sexual ethic in a really innovative expression of the dignity and equality of all humanity, rather than in the moralistic scolding which had been the focus of church teaching until then. John Paul's sexual teaching thus became a major tool that he was able to use in subtly fighting totalitarianism and materialism. And by the way, I should make clear that I don't agree with Catholic attitudes on birth control or on the ability of women to take top leadership positions in an organization. These attitudes are among many reasons that I am not a Catholic. But this Pope should be judged on what he has done and not on church law that he inherited. John Paul's striking departures from existing church policy that I can find are three. First, he rejected the just war doctrine that has prevailed since the day of St. Augustine in favor of an almost absolute pacifism. Next, his policy of respectful outreach to non-Catholics to try to increase the role of spirituality in human affairs in a truly non-sectarian way. This is something that Pope John the 23rd hesitantly advanced, but that this Pope, John Paul, has boldly promoted to the consternation of many in the Church. Lastly is his assertion that the Church has an obligation to acknowledge errors and apologize for them. Now, one could debate how perfectly he has instituted these policies, and Man of the Century contains a number of instances in which I think he bungled very badly. But if you look at the record, I don't see how you can question either the sincerity or the energy that he expended in trying to institute these ideas. Now, I've been asked to limit my opening remarks to allow plenty of time for questions, and I will answer them as long as there is time. So I want to use the balance of my time now to talk about my main theme, my main story, my main purpose in writing, and after all, I'm not a Catholic. My main purpose is to tell not just how this man resolved a crisis for the whole world, but how, by exercising a level of character and fortitude and dedication to pure principle that I would not have thought possible in a human being until I studied him, he provided an example of how any of us could change our world, regardless of the odds. And never did any person face greater odds than Karol Wojtyła, the future Pope, who has been shot at numerous times since childhood, including by the German army, who has suffered hardships so harrowing as to practically defy belief. To Americans who have been told for decades that our government budgets have to be consumed by military expenditures beyond what we can imagine or account for, nonviolence may seem a very naive idea, even if it's a noble one. But John Paul's success in using it against a greater power than even Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi had faced with it is a stunning example. Popular attitudes toward John Paul's role in history have been shaped largely, unfortunately, by hoaxes. And it has recently been a source of great frustration to me that the news outlets in the United States and elsewhere that spread these hoaxes are now unwilling to correct them. Most salient is the hoax advanced by the writer Carl Bernstein. And from what I've learned about his methods now, I will no longer call him a journalist. On the cover of Time magazine, on the cover of Reader's Digest, in a best-selling book, a purported papal biography called His Holiness, on numerous television shows, principally on NBC, he said that John Paul was engaged in some sort of holy alliance with President Reagan to pursue by covert means a shared policy that brought down communism. And this story is now commonly believed. I think my detailed fact-finding on pages 445 through 449 of Man of the Century should destroy Bernstein's credibility permanently. What he says is refuted by virtually everyone he claims supports his assertions. Most vividly, for example, I remember Archbishop Bronisław Dąbrowski in Warsaw, who, according to Bernstein, traveled regularly to the United States to plot this so-called Holy Alliance in meetings with CIA Director William Casey and the White House aide General Vernon Walters. When I asked Archbishop Dąbrowski about it, I feared that he is an elderly man, and from the way he looked, he was becoming ill. He left the room and came back with his passports and passionately turned page after page in front of me, declaring that he had not been in the United States since 1975. He had never met Casey or Walters, and that these stories were completely untrue. His face was red as he denounced, quote, the slanders of that American, close quote, referring to Bernstein. and said that he had written in vain to European newspapers that had reprinted these assertions, demanding a retraction, which he never got. By the way, General Walters, the only other living witness to these meetings, also flatly denied them to me. Walters gave me what seemed to be a full and believable account of his limited dealings with the Pope, which contained nothing of any holy alliance, as Bernstein described. Bernstein has proven similarly wrong at every turn. Yet Time magazine will not correct its record by printing a word about my book by way of news or review, despite requests, nor has Reader's Digest. NBC won't provide airtime to correct its disgraceful misinformation of the public. And yet you'll find in Man of the Century abundant proof that rather than help the Pope's non-violent revolution, the Reagan White House turned its back on solidarity and, as I'll explain in a moment, even tried to kill it. Another American biographer of Pope John Paul, Tad Schultz, adopted as his thesis the deceitful story given him by General Wojciech Jaruzelski, the Polish communist dictator, to the effect that Jaruzelski and John Paul worked as allies throughout the 1980s to bring down communism. The same Archbishop Dombrowski that I referred to a moment ago supplied me powerful evidence that, quite in contrast to what Tad Schultz wrote, Jaruzelski was personally responsible for the murder of Pope John Paul's devoted ally, Father Jerzy Popieluszko, a Polish hero, in 1984. Man of the Century also reveals that the Polish communists almost murdered Cardinal Wojtyła's assistant, Father Andrzej Bardecki, in an attack that Wojtyła said was meant for him, just months before he was elected Pope. This is the first time that attack has been disclosed in the Western press. The phony thesis of an alliance between John Paul and General Jaruzelski, put forward by this other biographer, Tad Schultz, made the cover of Newsweek, as well as Prime Network Television. And yet, Newsweek and the others have not corrected this error so far, despite many requests. An even more extreme hoax was put forward by the late journalist Claire Sterling, saying that Italian prosecutors had overwhelming evidence, independently verified, that the Soviets, through the Bulgarian secret police, were responsible for the gunshot assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II in St. Peter's Square in 1981. Sterling's work was advanced on the front page of the New York Times and 2 full pages inside in one of the longest and most influential articles that the Times has ever published, without even a trace of skepticism about the truth of the story. Rarely has the Times been so unequivocal about anything. The story also made the cover of Reader's Digest and a full-hour NBC special white paper in prime time. But in Man of the Century, you can read, for the first time, the account of the Italian prosecutor who tried to prosecute this case against the Bulgarians and now concedes that every bit of it is untrue. Every bit of the evidence put forward by the New York Times, Reader's Digest, and NBC, widely repeated by the entire press, is untrue, and there is no evidence whatsoever that the Soviets or the Bulgarians were behind the assassination attempt. Both of the papal biographies I mentioned earlier, Bernstein's and Schultz's, accept the truth of the Bulgarian connection hoax, as do other popular histories. And yet, will the New York Times or Reader's Digest or NBC correct the deceptions that they propagated? The Times and NBC are well aware of my book, but they have not corrected the record, except in a buried paragraph in one book review. I'm going to plead with you now, both those listening to me here and those listening over C-SPAN, and thank you very much, C-SPAN, for being here. I'm going to ask you to look at the evidence fairly. Unlike the authors of these other books, I am not quoting CIA documents. I'm not quoting unidentified CIA sources. I'm not quoting the self-serving accounts of American or communist politicians. Man of the Century offers the fully attributed words of direct participants from hundreds of interviews, mostly in Poland, because that is where the central events that ended the Cold War took place. I'll say something now, again, that may startle you, but I want to ask you to look at the evidence, not claims from Washington, but evidence on the ground in Eastern Europe. I know it's always dangerous to play what if with history, but I think the evidence suggests that if Karol Wojtyła had not become Archbishop of Krakow, there would have been no solidarity, and if there had been no solidarity, the Soviet Empire would still be running in 1997. Would communism have fallen without Karol Wojtyła? Well, I ask you to read pages 590 to 594 of Man of the Century about that. British colonialism in India probably would have fallen eventually without Mahatma Gandhi, and Jim Crow would probably have been erased in the United States without Martin Luther King. And communism probably ultimately would have ended for one or another of its failures. But ultimately is a long time, and it could be a bloody time. And in this nuclear era, it could have been a cataclysmically bloody time. These men, Gandhi, King, and Wojtyła John Paul, were really pivotal in what they did. Maybe Wojtyła John Paul most of all. The now declassified documents from the highest communist bodies, and in Man of the Century I quote the scholars who have examined these documents, and some of them I've read in translation myself. They show that the Kremlin leaders were not consumed, as we have been taught, in trying to match President Reagan's military buildup. They were certainly bothered by their blunder in Afghanistan and the American response, which was ordered by President Carter. But the Soviets were truly consumed for decades with the threat of the nonviolent revolution they saw growing out of the Polish church, and the notion that this revolution would spread, as it did, throughout Eastern Europe and the USSR itself. And yet, they could not stop it. I repeat, don't just listen to my words, read the evidence. We've been taught for years that the CIA is what created the underground press and radio in Poland. Bernstein and former CIA Director Robert Gates in his memoir last year still say this. I think I have accounted in Man of the Century for all of the main underground press outlets in Poland and the radio transmitters. They were the work of Poles, some of whom went to jail for it. And most of those Poles concede themselves that they could not have done that work except for the achievement and the protection provided by 2 decades of Karol Wojtyła's administration of the church as Bishop of Krakow. Dozens of leaders of underground solidarity who were responsible for these underground print and radio outlets insist on the record that they received no help whatsoever from the CIA and that they were incensed and still are at the very notion that they did. These leaders tried repeatedly to get help from the American government, which refused them. Mirosław Chojecki, the father of the Polish underground press, was actually at the White House the weekend martial law was declared in 1981. This has never come out before. On a trip to seek aid for the underground press, and the White House brushed him off. It gave him nothing. Over the next few years, desperate for money, the Solidarity leadership, unable to get anything from the United States, actually tracked down an Afghan guerrilla leader, a guy named Massoud, in order to persuade him, or try to divert to Poland some of the billions of dollars the United States was funneling to the Afghan rebels. And the Afghan turned them down. President Reagan even refused the request of Solidarity leaders to pose for pictures with them to make it more easy for them to raise private funds. Quite to the contrary, what the U.S. really did was try to persuade the AFL-CIO president, Lane Kirkland, who was Solidarity's best friend in the United States, to help restore normal commercial relations between the U.S. and communist Poland by killing Solidarity and recognizing instead the stooge union that the communists hoped to set up to replace it. And former Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger, who is the man Kirkland said was sent to him to deliver this message, won't deny it. He says it's probably true. If that's hard to believe, try this. The communists, in their efforts to destroy Solidarity, were helped not only by the United States government, but by Cardinal Joseph Glemp, the primate of Poland, who was consistently not a supporter of Solidarity, but a thorn in its side. All these people badly lacked the vision of victory that was within reach, as one man, Karol Wojtyła, Pope John Paul II, knew. Lacking that vision, the U.S. and Lech Wałęsa himself all tried to sell out Solidarity to the Stooge Union. One man stopped the communists in their efforts to kill Solidarity. The Pope, in a series of personal interventions in 1983 and 1984 that are described in detail in Man of the Century, with first-hand sources. You will read how the Pope confronted and backed down General Jaruzelski in a stunning private meeting, and then, a few days later, burst in to disrupt another private meeting between Jaruzelski's emissaries, the communists, and Cardinal Casaroli, the Vatican Secretary of State, who also was afraid of what John Paul was doing in stirring up this revolution and wanted to help the communists restore normal conditions. Yet, as critical as Wojtyła was to Solidarity's victory, I don't think he ever saw himself in the role of a political leader. The remarkable and inspiring hallmark of this entire story is that he reversed world history merely by dedicating himself to well-thought-out principles, including nonviolence and respect for the dignity of worth of every human being, even those who did not respect him. And he set out from youth to live his life that way. At each turn, he simply tried to advance, in whatever small way he could, what elements of justice were available to him. If you were to set a beginning for the revolution that overthrew communism, I think it might be the day in June of 1953 when Karol Wojtyła, a young priest who had just received his doctorate in philosophy, climbed 2 flights of wooden stairs in an office in downtown Krakow that I was also able to climb, to the newspaper Tygodnik Powszechny, a church-sponsored, semi-independent newspaper in Krakow that had just been put out of business by the Soviets in a repression following Stalin's death. Wojtyła had contributed poems and theatrical reviews to the newspaper. Arriving now in this time of turmoil, he listened to the editor, tried to describe to him the futile efforts to get the paper restarted by the communists. Wojtyła just asked the financial condition of all of the editors and their families who had been thrown out of work in this repression. Told things were tough, he pulled out his pay envelope and put it on the desk of the editor to be distributed to the families in need. This gesture of giving his own money, church money, to help what were in essence the nonviolent rebels of Poland impressed so many people. A number of other priests then followed suit, and a bishop. 30 years later, in the time of Solidarity, this example set an example for thousands of Poles who remembered it and contributed their own money to help the Solidarity fugitives and their families by repeating Wojtyła's gesture. That first pay envelope he gave wasn't large, but Man of the Century recounts how, as he rose to bishop and then archbishop, he secretly passed much larger envelopes of church cash to those who would use it to sustain the rebellion. This continued when he was pope, during times of Solidarity. Some of the funds that were passed by priests close to Wojtyła for use by the Polish underground, large amounts of them were stolen from the Vatican Bank by thieves involved in a major, notorious international bank scandal. All these stories are attributed to eyewitnesses and participants I interviewed who have never talked about these matters before. Shortly after he climbed the stairs back in 1953 to deliver that first pay envelope of cash to the resistance, Wojtyła published his first book, at the risk of imprisonment not just for himself and the printer, but for anybody who was caught with a copy of it. This volume, 250 copies of about that many pages, hand-pressed over typed matrices, had been lost to history until someone introduced me to that original printer back in 1953, who showed me his own preserved copy, which has been verified for me by the Vatican. The portions you will find reprinted in Man of the Century are amazing for several reasons. There are a specific blueprint for conducting a nonviolent revolution in almost the same language that was used a decade later by Martin Luther King in the United States. But they also contain an endorsement of elements of Marxism that criticize capitalism. They spell out a recipe for a Catholic social welfare state that is radically different not only from communism, but from utopian capitalism that is promoted now by politicians who have tried to claim John Paul for their ally. John Paul, as I show by quoting his speeches over the decades into the mid-1990s, has continued to espouse these same social welfare ideas ever since. He is a staunch opponent of utopian capitalism, which has been the emerging primary value of mankind since he helped, in ways I will now show, end communism. In 1960, soon after Wojtyła became a bishop, an editor of a magazine he oversaw introduced him to a Czechoslovakian couple who had managed to get government approval to cross the border into Krakow and travel there and approach the church secretly. As a result of that meeting, Wojtyła began secretly preparing for priesthood candidates from Czechoslovakia, the decimated Czechoslovakian church where most of the priests and bishops were in prison. These candidates would sneak across the mountain border into Poland to begin their training and sneak back again. Wojtyła established a smuggling network to bring study materials to them in Czechoslovakia. This has never come out before. He began secret, highly illegal ordinations in Poland of Czech priests and then bishops, and then similarly secret, illegal ordinations of other bishops, other priests candidates from around the East Bloc, particularly in Hungary and Ukraine. Under his direct supervision, the smuggling network grew throughout the East Bloc, involving laymen and well as priests whom I've interviewed. And you'll find in Man of the Century their personal attributed accounts. The contraband they brought included literature and political journalism, as well as religious materials. Much of this material was printed by a former philosophy student of Wojtyła's who set up a publishing company in Paris to smuggle the goods back into Poland. At one point, a whole boxcar load of this contraband, these smuggled materials, were shipped to co-conspirators within the Soviet Union itself, with bribes paid to some Soviet soldiers. More than once, Wojtyła disguised himself in civilian clothing and in great danger to himself, crossed the mountains daringly into Czechoslovakia and Hungary for a first-hand look. Also of great importance was the Church Synod he started in Krakow, modeled after the Church Synod suggested generally during the Second Vatican Council, but he turned his synod into an empowerment tool for thousands of Catholic intellectuals who had previously felt powerless and atomized under the system. Many of them grew into the leadership core of the movement that became Solidarity. Wojtyła turned his Krakow synod into a virtual shadow government, gaining substantial leverage with the communists and quietly training the intellectual core of the resistance movement. He began holding secret, highly illegal communication seminars for rebel leaders, some of whom were only recently freed from prison when they sneaked to Krakow or some other destination to attend. He used his philosophy classes and other personal contacts to train the cadre that became Solidarity. A good example is the case of Bohdan Savinsky, who first met Wojtyła by asking to go along on one of the famous canoe trips Wojtyła led as a young priest. Savinsky canoed and skied with Father and then Bishop Wojtyła for decades and was his philosophy pupil. Eventually, Savinsky became chief editor of one of these two seditious pro-liberty magazines that Wojtyła kept alive in Krakow against constant threat. His preservation of the only semi-independent, lively press in the entire communist bloc may be his single most important contribution. And these publications came under threat not only from the communists, but from traditional elements of the Catholic Church and their censors who considered them too socialist. The other magazine, the one not edited by Savinsky, was edited by another protege of the Pope's, Tadeusz Mazowiecki, who later became the first post-communist prime minister of Poland. Both Savinsky and Mazowiecki revealed for the first time in interviews for my book that it was Karol Wojtyła, the cardinal, in private meetings who persuaded them to lead a pivotal hunger strike that propelled what became the Solidarity Revolution. And it was this hunger strike that inspired Lech Wałęsa to join the labor union that Wojtyła's followers were organizing. I call it in the book the Boston Tea Party of the Polish Revolution. Savinsky and Antoni Macierewicz, another rebel whom Wojtyła had been encouraging in private meetings, then told me how Wojtyła had put the Polish church behind a flying university, a series of illegal public political meetings that followed the hunger strike. And it was only the church's risky patronage of these meetings that made them possible, and they began just months before he became Pope. All this is what led to the public recognition 2 years later of the labor union known as Solidarity and of the Solidarity Revolution that overthrew communism. Solidarity, though, meant much more to Karol Wojtyła than just a union that Lech Wałęsa was elected president of. It was an idea he espoused through his underground 1953 book on Catholic social welfare. It was subverted, this idea, within a year of Solidarity's victory in Poland, in large part by the very Western politicians who loved to portray themselves as Wojtyła's allies. This tragic downfall of what Wojtyła had fought for so long constitutes the last part of Man of the Century, which I have entitled Judgments. But I've now spoken long enough on my own, and I want to take questions as long as you want to ask them.
I would like to know what you attribute this conspiracy of the press to. I call it Catholic bashing. It's the best I can come up with it. But, you know, to think that NBC and all of these major forces would not tell the truth is rather staggering.
Well, I wouldn't call it a conspiracy. I don't think they set out to tell what was not the truth. Some people offered stories which were hoaxes. I mean, there's no other word for it. And I think the proof is there that they were hoaxes. These news outlets went out on a limb, on their own, on these hoaxes, embraced them. And it is not very comfortable to say that you're not just a minor story you report, but your cover story, your big lead in the New York Times, the story that you really made your own, is all wrong. I mean, it's hard to admit that. And that's the only thing I can attribute it to. I'm not a mind reader. I hope that these news outlets will start paying attention now.
I don't find it many other religious leaders of our time. It seems that it's always centered on the Pope.
Well, I don't think there's another religious leader or political leader or any kind of a leader of our time who's comparable to the Pope. And this man is a giant among popes as well as among others.
Yes.
I don't know of, I would not have imagined going into this book that there was a human being who could be quite this great. I just stand in awe of him. I probably would have said that the currents of history have much more to do with making allegedly great men than the other way around, but this has persuaded me otherwise. Yes, in the back?
I guess you are aware that...
I'm sorry?
I guess you are aware that there are many intellectual luminaries, non-Catholic, who have become Catholics. Among them are Arnold Toynbee, Gilbreth Keith Chesterton, Dave Brubeck, and our very own Chuck Gowdy. And I personally would like to invite you to become a Catholic.
I thank you very much for the invitation. I decline. Yes?
How many communications did you have with the Pope? Or did you just rely on all investigative?
Well, the Vatican Press Office and its director, Joaquin Navarro-Valls, who was one of the 3 or 4 people closest to the Pope, took a personal interest in this, and I think they must have discussed how they were going to treat me. I mean, the Pope knew what I was doing. And I think they decided that Navarro-Valls would be the intermediary. I was allowed to submit written questions through him and some oral questions, some of which would come back answered and more of which would not come back answered. But that's the way they decided to handle it. I'm glad to have had that much access. I long in my heart, for reasons besides merely fact-gathering, to meet this man who has become so important in my life and whom I've come to respect so much. He gave about 6 hours of time to another biographer, Tad Schultz, and the Vatican and the Pope were extremely disappointed with the use to which that time was made in the biography. And I think that helped determine that I was going to have to deal through one layer of intermediary.
Interesting.
Yes?
What can you share with us about what you've learned about the Pope's prayer life, either as it progressed through his vocation or as it stands now? And are you aware of any stories or any connections with any miracles that might be associated with the Pope?
Well, my whole book is about a miracle, that the communist empire could have fallen peacefully, non-violently, successfully, would have been denied in Washington even a year or two before it happened, even after Solidarity. And I think I show in Man of the Century that Solidarity was really running Poland beginning in 1986. It was over. Nobody could quite say that because the Soviet Union was there, the Communist Party was there. Solidarity, if it began to make too much noise openly, might have lost ground rather than gained it. But they were running Poland, opening up to free enterprise, and yet even then, in the West, it would not have been thought possible. In the 1960s, when Brezhnev came in the 1970s, during the brutal crackdowns under martial law in 1981, it was a miracle what the Pope did to, and again, the source of the miracle, I don't want to get into that. As far as his prayer life, I think even Catholics, even cardinals, are impressed that this is the most prayerful and I'm searching for a spiritual man, person they've ever encountered. From childhood, schoolmates would tell how everybody had to go into the church and genuflect once on the way to school, and they were all running and all late and fast they did it. Wojtyła was always there praying as others came in and as others left. Throughout his life, he would pick places within a Catholic church, not the main altar, but some special spot wherever he was going, whether it was a new place to go to school or a new town he was a priest in or wherever, a private prayer spot that he would go to over and over. And people would see him in that spot for hours. And this after he became Pope. Churchmen who had dealt with other popes remarked on how frequently, after every meeting or meal, he would take them into the chapel to pray. He had, this is a very powerful element in his life. It's, again, a source of awe to me. Thank you.
Let's thank Mr. Whitney for this presentation today.
Thank you.
He has certainly convinced me to read this book. The startling things that he mentioned today shows us how easily we can be misled and swayed into different opinions that may not be based on any facts or on any reality. Mr. Whitney will be at the back here now signing copies of his book for anybody who wishes that. And I'm sure there are more questions that you may have that you can address to Mr. Whitney here. I want to thank you for coming here today and for sharing in this very special presentation. God bless.